Welcome to the SLES for SAP roadmap session, Future 1152. My name is Christian Holsing, and I'm going to take you through the session and the content today. SLES for SAP is not a dedicated and own distribution. It basically is part of the SUSE Linux Enterprise Server family and inherits SLE also as part of the product. So it's part of the SUSE common code base, and with that also falls into the compliance, security management, and availability aspects that SUSE provides for these products. Of course, HANA is a little more limited than the SUSE Linux Enterprise Server in terms of platform support. So at this point in time, SLES for SAP is supported for Intel platform and IBM Power. NetWeaver has also support for IBM Z, where we do support SLES as well. So that's an option, but for on-premise deployments, ARM is just out of the scope, and at this point also AMD. So what is SLES for SAP? Basically, I said this before, SLES for SAP is based on the SUSE Linux Enterprise Server, so same binaries, same libraries. It adds the high availability extension to enable NetWeaver and especially HANA to be deployed in high availability setups based on SAP's recommendation for these deployments. We also provide enhanced service pack overlap support, which means that any given service pack of SLES for SAP sees a 4.5-year support life cycle. And we do have a set of SAP-specific components, tools, starting from the top with the SAP tools that we provide, including Subtune and the cluster tools, the HANA resource agent. So if just as a side note, if you want to run SAP HANA in an HA setup and want to use SUSE HA for that, you will need to go with SLES for SAP, as the HANA resource agents are only available as part of SLES for SAP. Then we have the cluster connector, which allows access to the pacemaker cluster from within the SAP management console, the deployment automation and monitoring project that we'll be talking about in a second, and a few YAST extensions. So that's what makes up SLES for SAP in general. We do also, and SAP supports SAP workloads on plain SLES, but as I said before, HANA HA requires SLES for SAP, and the tooling isn't part of plain SLES, and there is also no 24/7 priority support through SAP and SUSE included. So if you care for these features and components, then SLES for SAP is actually your choice over plain SLES. One thing that makes SLES for SAP pretty unique is the validation as an SAP endorsed app. So SUSE is the only OS operating system provider who offers this validation by SAP, and that allows customers to purchase SLES for SAP also through the SAP store. And let's not forget Project Trento. So that's a recent initiative that the team has been working on to help safeguard SAP deployments. But we cover this in more detail a little later. So let's talk a little bit roadmap. I have SP3, SP4, and SP5. So the past, the present, and the future. So to say, from the past perspective, SP3, what we shipped is the extended deployment automation and configuration support. So there has been some learning, scripts have been updated and are available for S/4HANA, HANA, and NetWeaver deployments. We spent some time simplifying the HA stack and starting to think about HA validation. Then the monitoring project was something that we spent quite some time on to push that forward and enhance that and make it happen. And also we spent time working on the toolkits, subtune and cluster tools. Just to name a few, subtunes are basically a major rewrite in the SP3 timeframe to version 3. SP4 is on the horizon, so it should GA in the next couple of weeks. And the key highlight from a SLES for SAP perspective here is Project Trento. So the idea really is to safeguard the SAP deployments and offer a set of checks and validation algorithms that help customers to basically validate their systems before they go live and during ongoing operation for compliance against SUSE best practices. We've also enhanced the HA stack quite a bit. So, for example, there is support of HANA scale-out multi-target replication, which means you have more than 2 nodes in your HANA environment, and 2 remain to be under a cluster. The third and the fourth potentially are tolerated, and the cluster doesn't interfere there. Okay, then subtooling updates. Subtune 3.1 is on the horizon. So that for an example there, and as I said before, we do inherit the base OS updates from plain SLES immediately. So new kernel, new libraries will just flow forward into SP4 as they do in SLES in plain SLES. And we did support over the last few months a initiative from SAP that moves the start framework that SAP uses to launch the different processes that make up an SAP system. That has been ported to support System D as the new default option. And we've been working very closely with SAP through our team on site in St. Leon Roth in the Linux lab to come to this point. For SP5, the plans are, and this is obviously a little vague, the plans are to continue to focus on Project Trento, add additional checks for on-premise deployments, for example. Right now we're looking at cloud-based deployments, and we will also add additional checks for additional HANA configuration and setups. Then we're looking into to enhance monitoring and add alerting right there. And basically also we want to look into the ability to automate the patching of the operating system for SAP workloads, including handover and cluster management, to just take this one step forward. And obviously we intend to work very closely with the SUSE Manager team here. And then I'm pretty sure we will see additional high availability capabilities that SAP brings forward, even more SAP tool updates. And basically, I would also expect there are a few SAP key initiatives that we will support. Good, let's talk about validation. This is obviously a little old news already because I'm talking about SP3 mainly. I just want to highlight this because SP3 has been the service pack from the SUSE side with the shortest SAP validation cycle. So SAP runs a very formal program to validate every major service pack, every major operating system update. So service pack qualifies as that for HANA, and that's a long list of tests and performance regression tests and so on. And the SUSE team has actually worked on in the background quite a bit to align the processes and increase testing. And from that perspective, that paid already off for SP3 big time, because it only took us 3 to 4 weeks after the initial release to get HANA validated. And we already work on SP4 pre-validation, so that we try to catch as much as possible early on, but latest I heard was that we're actually looking pretty good on SP4 and expect smooth sailing here as well. Monitoring project. I've spoken about this quite a bit, and those of you who have listened to my session last year might remember that. So the monitoring project was basically initiated from a cloud service provider who approached us and said, hey, we have a customer, they want to run on our platform, but they don't want to connect to their on-premise monitoring and want to use something in the cloud. Can you help us? And we basically took two projects out of the Kubernetes environment, which are Prometheus and Grafana, and started to make that more SAP specific. And at this point, the monitoring project provides a very holistic view on the stack, which means we're not only focused on the OS or the SAP side. We have the operating system, the cluster, and the key SAP metrics in this environment. And it was actually quite funny working very closely with a customer and SAP on a production issue when the customer basically pulled out the dashboard and showed it to SAP because they were suddenly able to correlate different events. And the discussion of there's a problem with the OS, you could just look at it and say, here's HANA, here's the OS, this is how they all are interdependent and related to each other, and that really helps finding root causes much better. The monitoring project also captures historical data, which is quite interesting. So you can analyze what happened in the system, dependent on your configuration, hours or days back. That's actually pretty cool. And we're also looking to bring additional data points forward. So I will also do a session with Intel, but just to call it out here, we basically published a white paper a few weeks ago how to also get hardware metrics embedded here. So one of the key use cases in the SAP space would be Optane, so that in the end, a customer who's running Optane or a large system with a large number of DIMMs also sees monitoring data from the hardware and, for example, can correlate a slower response time of the database down to a slow response time on one particular DIMM. So these things are very hard to find if you don't have a holistic view on the stack. What we're also trying to do and already working on is using Loki, which is a project out of the environment to also aggregate logs into the view, so that as a customer, you can basically search logs automatically for HANA failover messages and visualize them on the timeline. So that's quite handy, and we think that also provides huge value as well as alerting, which we're looking into, so that you can set certain thresholds, and as soon as the system reaches them, basically notify an admin to take a look at the system and prevent an outage. High availability, so key value proposition from a SUSE perspective. So we're definitely continuing to lead here, and there has been ongoing innovation. Our practice at this point is we're not waiting for a service pack in general. So if we have a feature ready that can go out in the wild, we add it to all supported versions. So if that's possible at all, we're trying to make informed judgments there, and then basically figure out can we support this and back to which level. But the rule of thumb is we're trying to backport it to any version that is under active support, especially for the SLES 15 code stream. So what we've done in the HA space is, as I said before, multi-target support for HANA scale-out clusters. So as you can see here, the environment, this is ERS, ASCS ERS, but if you think of this picture as the database, you could have 3 nodes, 2 under managed by the cluster, and a third one that is basically holding another copy of HANA as a DR environment, for example. And that becomes with scale out a little more complicated than for scale up. Anyway, we also work closely with SAP on a simplified mount structure for NetWeaver deployments. So there's only in this specific setup that has been documented as well, 1 mount point per system that you need to set. There is a feature called the HANA Takeover Blocker. I'm pretty sure Fabian and Lars will talk about in their HA session. And we've been working closely with cloud service providers to support TCO reduction scenarios like multi-SID support or shared deployments of NetWeaver and HANA in the same VM. So various projects that are ongoing, and as soon as they are ready, they will be published on the best practices site. In general, let me just briefly touch this. In general, we look to support SAP workloads on all various deployment methods. So may it be on-premise, virtualized in VMware or KVM. You might have noticed that the team has restarted KVM validation. So the first one we've passed, and we're just working towards the second and third. Hyperconverged is an interesting topic. So Nutanix is obviously supported. We're looking into the SUSE stack as well and see what's possible there. And then especially the CSP, the cloud-based deployments, where we work very, very closely with most of the large hyperscalers to provide images for them. So that's a huge difference. We actually build the image and maintain the image for the hyperscalers in contrast of the competition. Okay, I already mentioned this briefly, so and I'm sure if you're interested, take a look at the security certifications for plain SLES, but SLES for SAP and SLES are from the core components identical. SLES for SAP also inherits the security certifications, may it be FIPS 140-2, may it be common criteria certification, or the stick hardening work that Dietrich's team is doing right now. That's all supported and available if that makes sense from an SAP context in SLES for SAP. Okay, and with that, let's move to Trento and talk a little bit about that. So, one thing we've noticed over the last 1.5 years was that the high availability stack in its configuration was actually perceived as sort of complicated. And we also see customers are migrating from non-Linux systems to Linux systems slowly. And that imposes a challenge on them. And we looked and discussed with a customer advisory board and a few other customers, how could we help, right? Because none of us really wants to be in escalations to find out there is a misconfiguration where the admin went wrong or where you have a missing device and a single point of failure. And Trento is the answer to that from a SUSE perspective. So what Trento does, it's a web console. Technically, it's a container that you can run on any supported Kubernetes environment, even for a test deployment on K3s as a single node Kubernetes host. And there is a little agent that's being deployed on the SLES for SAP system. And that agent executes checks and communicates data back to the centralized Trento console, which, as you can see here on the screenshot, gives you a neat overview of a system and the state of the system. So as an admin, you basically see, do I have critical issues that I need to worry about? Where is my environment running? What basically are the functions of the environment? So we auto-discover pretty much the environment. and render it. And from the central screen, from the SAP systems view that you're looking at here, you can basically jump to the system and the aspect of the system you care about. May it be the HANA cluster at the bottom here, if you want to understand the pacemaker configuration, or the host and understand what the host is looking like. So that's pretty simple. We also feature a dashboard, which was a nice impulse on the customer advisory board for that people would really appreciate that and understand if the system is up and healthy. So and that's the user interface of what Trento looks like today, and it runs on an ongoing basis. So you can actually use Trento before you go live or after you went live to really manage the stability and the compliance of your system. So from a vision perspective, top left to bottom right. So configuration checks, that's the heart and soul. So we do have checks for all aspects of pacemaker and the SAP specific configuration. And it's specific to the hyperscaler the system runs on. So values are different from Azure compared to AWS to Google Cloud. And that's all factored in. We do monitor the SAP landscape and want to enhance that. Right now we have the key OS metrics as a starting point, but we're really planning within the next couple of weeks to start enhancing that part and add more components. And I touched on the hardware specific information already, so that's intended to flow in here. Visualization of the complete SAP environment, that's the auto discovery function that I briefly mentioned, that is available and helps a Linux admin to understand what's running on their host. Usually it would be not very transparent, I guess. What we're looking into is AI supported system checks. So, and some feedback, really collecting the information, bringing it together, and based on certain patterns, go out and figure out that, for example, at the end of the month, you're having a peak on the NetWeaver server, and make some recommendations out of that. Or, from learnings that we see in support, have a check that goes back to a customer environment, which is decoupled. So there is no cloud connection here except for pulling down rules. So all the processing is done locally. So really looking if a specific version is installed that's known to have problems with a specific configuration. So these kind of things we're looking into. As I mentioned, Trento is containerized, can be deployed anywhere. So you can set up a dedicated Kubernetes environment or just use the public Kubernetes service. Very simple. And as it is Kubernetes, it's very simple to install. We provide a Helm chart. And for the SLES for SAP host, basically, it's also an RPM install. So no big deal, in the one command line to connect it back to the main Trento console. I should basically mention we have two flavors of Trento out. So one is the community edition that's openly developed on GitHub. And then there is the premium edition that requires a SLES for SAP subscription and is provided through the SUSE registry. So just if you want to look at it, the difference is the amount of checks. The premium edition has a lot more checks to offer. Okay, so I mentioned this before, but if you think about Trento, think about all this wonderful best practice documentation that Fabian, Lars, Bernd, and others have maintained over the years as code. So the knowledge that these guys have built up has basically been transferred into the checks, and we think that's probably better to consume, easier to consume, and on an ongoing basis, you get this right. So that's the one takeaway. If you don't understand what Trento is, think about it as the best practices guides in an interactive mode. Okay, so I think I covered most of these points already. What you see here is the dashboard, basically. So this is an SID view. So if you're not too familiar with an SAP environment, there are multiple SAP systems that companies are running, and you basically see here that not much is up here in this test environment. A lot of black and red, not a lot of green. But for NWQ, you basically see directly that you want to take a look at your pacemaker cluster, because there are some warnings here. So it's a traffic light system that we do use here. A few testimonials, and the first one is actually the one that scared us, I think, the most, because that customer just took a very early alpha and just threw it into their quality system, which was a interesting test for the development team, but it was working fine. And all three customers have actually really helped us to shape Trento and also understand their specific constraints in their environments and factor that in. Okay, and then to wrap the session up, there are a few more things here. So obviously we keep working on container-based workloads. At this point, it's still the focus on the SAP side for on-premise deployments is data intelligence. So that remains to be a SUSE-based container. We achieved validation of RKE, the Rancher Kubernetes Engine 1 and 2. So colleagues continue to work on this validation. It's high level, pretty similar to what's happening on the HANA side. So that's all ongoing. Obviously, we're working with SAP to explore a few other container-based options and what we can do in that space. And then there is also beloved SAP Business One for HANA. So we do have a 15 SP2 image out there. We haven't updated it to SP3 for a pretty simple reason, because we're actually working on a new installer process and pattern. We're testing this on an SAP SMB event and hopefully get this out in the next few months. And that would enable a customer to basically just take a plain SLES image and register it, pull down the installer at that point, and then have the partitioning and the Business One installation in an automated fashion right after that. So that's where we are, and not to forget, there's a new offering for Business One, which also has LTSS included, or SPOS. So look out for that. Find us if you want to have more details on it. So there's also quite a bit of movement in these two areas. Good. With that, I'm at the end of my time. Thank you very much for spending the time with me and listening to this presentation. I hope you have a great SUSECON. And please feel free to reach out to the team should you have any further questions. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.